latest top tips, reviews and advice, please subscribe below.
Hello and welcome to Attwoolls Outdoors with me, Mike. Today I'm giving you guys a bit of kind of an advice video, but almost a bit of comparison as well. So today what we're talking about is polyester versus polycotton. Whether it be for a tent or for an awning, what is the best material? Now, arguably, actually, to be fair, there's not really a true answer to that. It's down to kind of what conditions you're going to use and where you're going to use it. Now, there are pros and cons to both, and basically throughout this video we're going to go through what those are and sort of go a bit more of a comparison, really, because it depends on how you're going to use it, what you're going to use it for, to which I would probably say is a better recommendation. So, in terms of fabric, they are both very different. Traditionally, we've always had canvas tents, going back, through the 60s, 70s and so forth, 80s. Polyester really didn't come into the market until probably early 90s, and then it's pretty much now what we see mostly in the UK. We, in the UK, to be fair, can probably get away with it just because our kind of climate and our temperature isn't quite as drastic or as intense as kind of mainland Europe. It's not, we don't have as hot a summers as them. So really, that's one of the key things. Polyester essentially was basically brought in, like I said, when sort of production moved a bit more to the Far East rather than directly in Europe. Now, the importance of kind of the polyester is actually it's very inexpensive to produce. So suddenly tents dropped in price, became a lot more affordable, and to the extent today, even though the prices have steadily increased over the many years, it's still probably a more affordable option to go for. In terms of its sort of features as well, it's actually not a breathable material. So how they make polyester essentially is when all the threads basically get woven into material and they produce tents out of them, what you find is that they have to put essentially a PU coating on the back of the polyester to make it waterproof. Now, it depends on the level of coating they tend to put on it. It's almost referring to what its waterproof level is. And it's something we only see as a statement in kind of polyester tents of hydrostatic head. Now, what hydrostatic head essentially is a waterproof level. We see it in jackets, we see it in everything. It's a kind of enamel actual kind of quoting, and the way they test it is they get essentially a fabric, stretch it out over a kind of a big cylinder, fill it with water until they get 3 pin drops of water directly come through. Now what this essentially does, it gives it a rating, so how much pressure will allow the water through. So the higher the number, the better the waterproof rating is. Typically, I would say for the UK market, a starting point I would say you wouldn't want to go anything below is about 3,000 mil. Certainly when it comes to a polyester tent. For smaller backpacking tents and things like that, it's a little bit different because it's a little bit different purpose. But for me, 3,000 is min, and then we have some brands that even go up to 10,000, which is a bit overkill. But it's all about being a point of difference and a different kind of, be able to hold a different level. It's worth mentioning at this point that essentially a poorly pitched polyester tent will actually perform worse than a well-pitched polyester tent. So it's not also down to what you've got in terms of materials, but how you use it. One thing we do see with polyester, certainly now that we've got sewn in ground sheets, is you do get a lot more condensation. And this has really been a big issue, certainly in the last sort of 6-7 years, more so since air came into part, because there's less ventilation in tents, so you have less circulation of air. It's all stagnant, and it just literally hangs in the roof fabrics and drips directly down. Now, the materials themselves are very waterproof, so it's ridiculously highly unlikely that you'll ever get water coming directly through the material. But what it may possibly come through to is obviously the stitching that joins it together. You can imagine punching holes in waterproof materials isn't brilliant. So what they have to do essentially is tape the seams. By taping the seams, it's basically heat welding tape over the seams to make it waterproof. That's the only really place that if water's going to come in, it's going to come in at that point. And the reason I say this is because a tent, polyester tent, or any tent actually for that matter, is made out of fabric. The fabric's cut in big batches. So when they piece it together, sometimes it won't be from the same roll. It'll match in terms of the colour, but you won't ever get leaking coming from everywhere. It will be a physical isolated position. And that's where we get a lot of confusion, certainly nowadays, with kind of polyester. Polyester, don't get me wrong, is a really great material. Not only is it kind of inexpensive, but it's quick to dry out, packs down nice and lightweight, and when it's packed away, you know, it can be left a little bit longer in its bag, kind of soaking wet. It hasn't got as a detrimental effect with it. Now, if we take everything I've just said there and then we look at polycotton as a comparison. So firstly, polycotton's breathable. So on a warm day, it's a lot cooler on the inside. Essentially, the weave of the material can expand out, allow air to pass through it. On a cold day, the weave tightens and keeps the warmth in. So you really get the best of both worlds in that sense. In terms of the actual fabric as well, you don't tend to get condensation because you've got that breathability. You always maybe get a touch of it because there's a lot of moisture, especially like I said with sun and ground sheets, but it's never anywhere near as apparent. And if it's going to be anywhere, it's going to be in the PVC windows, which obviously aren't breathable. It's actually a blend of polyester and polycotton, hence the name Polycotton. Polyester and cotton. Typically, it depends on the ratio, but it normally tends to be about 65-35 in favour of polyester. Just that way, it's a little bit lighter, and that's one of the joys of polycotton in comparison to full canvas. So you've got almost a scale at the canvas's top end, very expensive, very heavy, and obviously breathable, has a long lifespan. Polyester's at the bottom end in that, you know, lightweight, not breathable, but still packs down small and light. And we've got the middle side here. So it means the polycotton's a little bit lighter in weight in comparison to canvas. It dries out a little bit quicker, still not anywhere near as quick, I'd say, as polyester. And again, from pack size, it's a little bit lighter, but still considerably bigger than polyester. So it's worth bearing in mind all these sort of things in terms of pack sizes, pack weights, when we come to look at buying a tent and seeing how it reacts. Polycotton doesn't actually have a waterproof rating because if we were to do that cylinder test, the water just pour through. But we know physically from years and years use that essentially the cotton itself swells and plumps up and then essentially seals itself. So that is one thing that's worth mentioning. The first time you get a polycotton tent, you need to pitch it, get it wet. So it's better to do it in your own garden in a controlled environment. Get a hose pipe, give it an absolute drenching. I mean, absolutely get it sodding wet everywhere. Allow it to dry naturally and then pack it away. Once you've done this, normally it's the first time essentially the material itself can plump up and swell and basically sort of seals any holes or anything like that. But it can be a thing that happens second or third time. But by doing it one good time, normally tend to solve the issue. Now, the reason it's important to do this before you go away is because it essentially will let a bit of water in at its time. So you don't want to be actually using that as your accommodation and getting all that wet weather in. So ideally, if you can do it before, it's the best scenario. Plus the fact that it actually gives you the opportunity to practice with the tent and check it over. Again, being your accommodation, it's essential that that's in a working order. When it comes in a pre-packed box, you don't actually know that, or if there's something missing, there's a manufacturing fault. And arguably you say the same with polyester. You know, you want to make sure you check your tent before you go away. That way, if you've got any problems, you can deal with it ahead of time, rather than when you've got no other option but to stay in it or take it down. And then it affects everyone's mood. So one thing we see certainly coming a bit more over the few years is we're seeing a little bit of a retraction back to kind of polycotton, more breathable fabrics. Not only because of that whole breathability in it, but also you find you get a longer lifespan. So it's tricky to give a perfect lifespan on a material because it varies so much. It depends on where you go, how long you go for, what conditions you have, how you pack it away, how you store it. You know, how much sunlight you get, how much rain you get. It's so many different variants to it. It's not a clear cut, this will last for this long. If I give you a very ballpark, don't hold me to a figure, I would say a bog standard polyester tent, about 70 denier, you might get possibly about 12 weeks of constant use in the UK. Now, it varies about that because it depends on, one of the main killers for tents in general is kind of the UV sunlight. It basically shines the material, makes it very brittle, and then becomes very papery thin. So what you find is that after time, the colour of it actually generally fades, and then it starts to rip. Once you get to that stage, you can't really repair it because it will just carry on going as soon as you start stitching holes into it. So from that point of view, you know, if we said it was 12 weeks, that could be 2 weeks a year for 6 years. It could be once a week for, you know, and that's kind of like a worst case scenario. And that's where we also do find there are different grades of polyester, different kind of, I'll use the term thickness. We use typically kind of the term denier. Denier refers, like with tights, the thickness of kind of the thread. Now this varies along the thread itself, so it's not always 100% accurate, but gives you a better idea. I.e. the thicker the thread, the thicker the material, the longer lifespan you're going to have. Unfortunately, it doesn't work as simply as double the thread, double the lifespan. It's not quite that simple. And to be fair, probably these thicker fabrics haven't been around that long. You know, we've probably taken 10 years. It's really hard to grasp how long they truly last. But one thing's for sure, essentially when you get to kind of a thicker material, tends to be that you also get a jump up in specification. So they'll use a higher waterproof level and have higher features. So that's always something to bear in mind. In terms of the concept of drying it, it's still going to be dried just as quickly, but you have a little bit more durability into it. So it's going to last a bit longer than your standard polyester. I referred earlier on to about packing it away wet. Now this is quite crucial with the fabrics. So what you find is polyester, because it's a synthetic fabric, essentially it doesn't matter too much if it's stored wet. For me, you never want to store a tent in a bag wet more than 48 hours. When it comes to polycotton, because you've got that cotton element to it, it's even more imperative it gets dry as soon as possible. So I wouldn't say probably 24-hour max in there, otherwise you'll start sounding musky. And you kind of get that with polyester to a certain degree as well. It's just that probably it's less temperamental the longer you leave it. With polycotton, because it sets in a bit more. Once you get mold and mildew into the tent, it's really hard to eradicate. So again, it's whether you want to take care of your kit, and naturally because it's more expensive anyway, you're spending the money, you want to take care of it and make sure it lasts. Now, it doesn't matter if the tent gets put away back in its bag wet. You want to try and make sure it's dry, of course. But you want to get it home straight away, put it up and air it out. It doesn't matter if it's still getting wet. It's as long as it's not in a small bag, getting warm and moist, and it's a perfect kind of breeding ground for mold and mildew. And that's one of the big things about it, is you want to make sure that with a tent like this, you've got enough room you can put it up. And the joys of kind of air tents or even sort of pole tents to a certain extent, if it's not overly a windy day, you can peg the main four corners, pump it up, and it will dry a lot quicker. Reason being is air can circulate interiorly and also externally. So it means that certainly with polycotton, it dries from both sides. And the same with polyester, you see it doesn't absorb any of the kind of wetness to it. So arguably it would essentially dry quicker because it just essentially runs and beads off. So that's certainly things to worry about. Now, so we've talked about the overall kind of what the material does, how it reacts in terms of the wet and obviously the warmth. And that's one thing for sure, that it'll be a bit of a greenhouse in polyester because it doesn't breathe. But it's also worth talking about the fact that in the pack weight, when it is wet, it's going to be a little bit heavier in both ways, probably a little bit more so in polycotton than polyester. Other things to mention, the fact that you don't have kind of that whole kind of tape seam scenario with polycotton. It's just the thread swells up and plumps up and keeps it all nice and neat. But from a lifespan, I would say you're probably looking arguably 2 to 3 times the length in polycotton in comparison to polyester. So it's quite a considerable difference between the two. So not only you're paying more money, because it's more expensive fabric to make for you know, the tent itself, but you're getting something that's going to last longer. It's quieter in the wind because it's more of a natural fabric. It's not that kind of synthetically kind of flappy noise. So that's also kind of another thing to also consider. And it tends to sit a lot smarter. I find it's very easy to get kind of a polycotton tent just looking pucker. With polyester, you tend to see more creases and lines in it, which naturally kind of fall out, to be fair, with polycotton. But that kind of gives you a bit more of an overview between the two. Hopefully I haven't rabbited on too much. But for me, you know, I would always try and say, look, if you're going away to Europe or you want a more comfortable camping trip, then polycotton's the way to go. Okay, it's more expensive, and it's fine if you can obviously afford it and you are happily with the pack size and pack weight. Then for me, it's the #1 things to go. Generically in the industry, we see less issues with polycotton, mainly because of the breathability, but also there's less workmanship goes into it to a certain extent because they haven't suddenly got to tape all the seams in the roof. And then to a certain degree, the more something has got to be worked on, the more likelihood there's going to be an issue with it. So that's also worth of consideration. For the UK use, and certainly, you know, for polyester is more than happy to use, you know, on a kind of normal day in the UK, you know, happily being there. It's definitely more cost effective. It's less kind of high maintenance, as I probably would say, than say the polycotton. And there tends to be more options and more affordable choices because it's definitely more of a premium kind of feel to it. If you feel free, you're more welcome to check the link below this video. We've got kind of a range of polycotton tents and polyester tents sort of situated there. So we kind of categorize them by that so you can check it out. Each tent tends to be different in terms of its features. So it's a mixture of kind of air polycotton, poled and air, of course, polyester as well. But we're seeing, like I said, a bit more resurgence come back to polycotton just because of the features of it, that more natural fabric, and it's, again, the lifespan of it. You know, you pay for what you certainly do get. But any more questions or queries, you have any more kind of things you'd like to know about polyester or polycotton, you're always welcome to either email us directly or failing that, you're welcome to comment in the box below. But hopefully you found this video helpful and give you a bit more of an insight, or maybe a bit too much detail, insight into the differences between the materials. It's almost worth checking out. We've also done a separate kind of videos on poled versus air, and a separate one again about kind of choosing the right tent in terms of overall size of it, shapes, designs, features. So that's also worth a look if you're trying to sort of compare and contrast between what kind of is best for you. And that's part of the whole thing. It's kind of working out what you're going to do, how you're going to use it, and then if need be, we can always try and help make a recommendation of what would necessarily be the best tent that kind of fits your needs. But that's everything for the time being. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.